"This piano wasn't meant for someone like you." The words echoed through the century-old auditorium with a chill that seemed to drain every whisper from the room. Nearly 1,000 people sat beneath towering oak beams and stained glass windows, glowing with the soft gold of a late spring afternoon. But in that single moment, every eye found the same 17-year-old boy standing beside the polished grand piano at center stage. Elijah Carter didn't answer. His fingers remained wrapped around the worn edges of the sheet music his father had carefully flattened the night before, and his shoulders stayed relaxed even as the silence grew heavier with every passing second. Principal Richard Collins stood beside the microphone with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. His tailored navy suit, silver tie, and polished shoes reflected the bright stage lights, while the gold emblem of Westbridge Academy shimmered behind him on a massive velvet curtain, prepared for the school's 100th anniversary celebration. Alumni had flown in from across the country. Local reporters adjusted their cameras near the front row. Wealthy donors whispered among themselves beneath crystal chandeliers. Parents balanced phones in the air, eager to capture a ceremony meant to celebrate excellence. Nobody had expected the most unforgettable moment to arrive before the music had even begun. Elijah's dark eyes lifted calmly toward the principal, not with anger or embarrassment, but with the quiet expression of someone who had grown familiar with being underestimated. He wore a charcoal gray suit that had clearly been tailored more than once. The sleeves rested just a little too short against his wrists, and the shine on his black dress shoes came not from expensive leather, but from careful polishing. Everything about him reflected effort instead of privilege. Behind the curtains, the faint scent of furniture polish mixed with fresh flowers drifted through the backstage air, while members of the school orchestra exchanged uncertain glances. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the music teacher whose silver curls framed a face lined by decades of patient encouragement, tightened her grip around a folder of concert programs. She knew exactly how many nights Elijah had spent practicing inside the small church 3 miles from campus after everyone else had gone home. She knew how many Saturdays his father had waited in the hallway reading old newspapers while his son repeated the same difficult passage until midnight. She also knew that none of those people sitting beneath the chandeliers knew any of that. To them, Elijah was simply the janitor's son. Richard Collins slowly looked toward the audience before speaking again, his voice smooth enough to sound polite while carrying just enough doubt to wound. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's performance requires exceptional precision. Our scheduled guest artist experienced an unexpected medical emergency only this morning, and while we're grateful that one of our own students volunteered to help, we should remember that courage and preparation are not always the same thing." A ripple of restrained laughter floated across several rows near the front. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Elijah heard it anyway. Somewhere in the middle section, someone quietly murmured that this would probably be over in a minute. Another parent whispered that the school should have simply canceled the performance. One donor leaned toward another and questioned whether letting an inexperienced student touch such an expensive Steinway was really appropriate. Their voices blended into a distant hum, fading beneath the steady rhythm of Elijah's breathing. Beyond the stage lights, he spotted a familiar figure standing near the open side entrance where employees usually entered the building. Marcus Carter remained half hidden behind a stone column, still wearing the dark green maintenance uniform he hadn't had time to change after finishing the morning shift. A folded cleaning cart rested beside him. His work gloves stuck out from one back pocket, and faint streaks of floor wax still marked the sleeves of his shirt, despite his best efforts to wash them away in the staff restroom. He had quietly stepped into the auditorium, hoping nobody would notice. He never wanted attention. He had spent 15 years making sure every hallway, classroom, and stage in Westbridge Academy looked perfect for other people's moments. Today, for the first time, the most important moment belonged to his son. Marcus didn't wave. He simply nodded once. It was the same small nod he had given Elijah every evening before another practice session inside the little brick church where an aging upright piano waited beneath a wooden cross. It meant exactly what it had always meant. "Keep going." Elijah lowered his eyes toward the smooth black and white keys resting beneath the warm lights. Their glossy surface reflected fragments of stained glass overhead, scattering tiny patches of blue, amber, and crimson across polished ivory. Somewhere high above, sunlight poured through the century-old windows, filling the hall with a quiet glow that softened every corner, except the one occupied by doubt. The applause from earlier had disappeared. The whispers had faded. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, uncertain whether they were about to witness an awkward mistake or something no one had anticipated. Richard Collins stepped back from the microphone with a measured smile that suggested the ceremony would soon continue exactly as planned. He folded his hands behind his back, certain that expectations would soon match reality. But Elijah Carter wasn't looking at the principal anymore. He was looking at the piano, the same way he had looked at every instrument he had ever been trusted to touch, as though music had never cared about someone's last name, their bank account, or the color of their skin. And in the silence stretching across the grand old hall, before a single note had been played, something almost invisible began to change. Elijah slowly adjusted the piano bench, careful not to let it scrape across the polished stage floor. The tiny movement sounded far louder than it should have inside the enormous auditorium. Somewhere near the back, an air conditioning vent hummed steadily, blending with the faint rustle of expensive dresses and pressed jackets as people settled deeper into their seats, waiting for what many had already decided would become an uncomfortable interruption to an otherwise flawless celebration. They did not know the story that had carried him to this moment. They had never seen the small brick church on the east side of town, where every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday evening, the sanctuary remained open long after sunset, because Pastor Daniel Harper knew one determined teenager needed a quiet place to practice. The old upright piano there had yellowed keys, chipped wood, and one stubborn note that always sounded slightly flat during humid weather. Yet Elijah had treated it like the greatest concert instrument in the world. He had learned every weakness of that piano until even its imperfections became part of the music. Long before sunrise each school day, while most students slept, Marcus Carter unlocked the maintenance office at Westbridge Academy, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a ring of keys that jingled softly against his belt. He swept hallways, repaired loose classroom doors, replaced burned-out light bulbs, and polished trophy cases, filled with awards celebrating students whose families often passed him without learning his name. Sometimes Elijah accompanied him during school breaks, quietly helping gather trash bags or stack folding chairs after basketball games. Marcus never complained about the work. He simply believed that every honest job deserved dignity, and he repeated the same sentence to his son so often that Elijah could hear it even when his father remained silent. Character is what you do when nobody is watching. That lesson stayed with him far longer than any music exercise. Money had always been carefully measured inside their modest two-bedroom apartment. New clothes usually came from neighborhood donation drives or clearance racks after the season had ended. Marcus fixed broken appliances instead of replacing them. Every birthday cake came from the same local bakery because the owner quietly charged half price after learning how hard Marcus worked. Yet somehow there was always enough encouragement to make impossible dreams feel practical. When Elijah first mentioned wanting piano lessons at 8 years old, professional instruction cost more than their monthly grocery budget. Marcus simply smiled, thanked the music store owner for the information, and spent the next several weeks asking every church within 20 miles whether anyone knew an elderly pianist willing to teach a curious little boy. That search led them to Mrs. Louise Bennett, an 83-year-old retired choir director whose hands had become too stiff for long performances, but whose love for music had never faded. She refused to accept payment. Instead, she asked only one thing: "Promise me the boy practices harder than anyone else." Elijah kept that promise every single week. While friends played video games or spent weekends at shopping malls, he sat before weathered piano keys counting rhythms until his fingers ached. Mrs. Bennett corrected every mistake with remarkable patience, never raising her voice, only reminding him that beautiful music was built from thousands of small choices made correctly. She taught him that every note deserved respect, whether anyone applauded or not. When she passed away 2 years earlier, Pastor Harper had quietly handed Elijah the worn leather notebook she had used for decades. Inside its faded pages, she had written one sentence beneath his name: "Never perform to impress people. Perform to remind them that hope still exists." Elijah carried those words with him every day. Even now, folded inside the inner pocket of his suit jacket, that small page rested close to his heart. Across the auditorium, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks remembered reading those same words during Elijah's final lesson before the regional youth music competition, the contest he had never entered because the registration fee exceeded what Marcus could spare after unexpected medical bills. She had watched disappointment briefly cross Elijah's face that afternoon before he quietly smiled and returned to practicing anyway. He had never complained. He had never blamed anyone. He simply believed another opportunity would arrive when the time was right. Perhaps that quiet resilience puzzled people who barely knew him. Teachers often described Elijah as unusually calm, but calm did not come naturally. It came from years of choosing gratitude over frustration, discipline over resentment, and faith over fear. Each difficult season had become another measure in a composition only he could hear. As the afternoon sunlight continued drifting across the stained glass above, its colors slowly reached the piano lid beside him, painting soft reflections across polished ebony. Elijah rested both hands gently above the keyboard without touching a single key. He closed his eyes for one slow breath and remembered the echo of the little church sanctuary, the scent of old hymn books, Mrs. Bennett's gentle smile, Pastor Harper's quiet encouragement, and his father's steady nod after every practice session, no matter how late the hour had become. Those memories surrounded him far more completely than the whispers filling the grand auditorium. For everyone else, this was a prestigious school ceremony. For Elijah Carter, it was simply another chance to honor every person who had believed in him long before anyone else had reason to. The silence lingered just a little longer than anyone expected, stretching across the grand hall until even the smallest sounds became impossible to ignore. A program slipped from someone's lap onto the carpet. A camera shutter clicked near the front row before its owner quickly lowered the lens. High above the stage, sunlight continued filtering through stained glass, washing the century-old walls with shifting ribbons of amber and blue that slowly drifted across the polished lid of the Steinway. Richard Collins remained perfectly still with his hands folded behind his back, convinced that patience alone would expose what he believed everyone else was about to witness. During his 12 years as principal, Westbridge Academy had become one of the most respected private schools in the state. Enrollment had doubled, donations had reached record numbers. National rankings decorated every admissions brochure. Collins often reminded faculty members that reputation was not built through good intentions, but through flawless execution. Every public appearance, every ceremony, every concert represented the school's image. And in his mind, image mattered above everything else. Earlier that morning, he had stood inside his office overlooking the football field while speaking with members of the Board of Trustees. They had discussed scholarship campaigns, expansion plans, and a new performing arts center expected to cost more than $12 million. Several major donors attending today's celebration were considering gifts large enough to make that dream possible. Collins knew every speech, every performance, and every photograph captured during the event might influence those decisions. He believed uncertainty had no place on a stage built to impress people accustomed to perfection. When the internationally recognized guest pianist canceled only hours before the ceremony because of a sudden illness, panic briefly spread through the organizing committee. Teachers searched desperately for alternatives. Several suggested removing the musical performance entirely. Others proposed asking one of the advanced orchestra students to play a short selection instead. Then Mrs. Evelyn Brooks quietly mentioned Elijah. The conference room had fallen silent in a remarkably different way from the auditorium now surrounding the stage. Collins remembered staring across the table before slowly shaking his head. A maintenance employee's son had never represented the academy during its most important annual celebration. There were traditions to protect, expectations to meet. Mrs. Brooks calmly explained that Elijah had memorized the complete performance months earlier after practicing alongside the guest artist during rehearsals. She spoke with complete confidence, describing his discipline, his musical instincts, and the unusual emotional depth he brought to every rehearsal. Collins listened politely, but remained unconvinced. Talent alone, he believed, did not prepare someone for the pressure waiting beneath television cameras and influential audiences. Eventually, there had been no better option. Time had disappeared. The ceremony could not continue without music. Collins agreed, although only because every other possibility had collapsed. Now, standing a few feet behind the piano, he watched Elijah with narrowed eyes, searching for the nervous habits he expected to appear. A trembling hand, restless breathing, a hesitant glance toward the audience. Instead, he found almost unsettling composure. That quiet confidence irritated him more than visible fear would have. Near the front row, Board Chairman William Prescott leaned toward another trustee and whispered something too softly for most people to hear. The older gentleman adjusted his glasses before studying Elijah with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Across the aisle, several alumni who had once studied music at prestigious conservatories exchanged uncertain expressions. They recognized the instrument immediately. Concert grand pianos of that quality revealed every weakness. They forgave nothing. Either a performer earned the audience's respect within the opening phrases, or every mistake became painfully obvious. Backstage, members of the orchestra waited with their instruments resting quietly in their laps. Violin bows remained lowered. Brass players held their breath almost unconsciously. Even the student stage crew stopped moving scenery for the next presentation, because nobody wanted to interrupt whatever might happen next. The atmosphere no longer resembled a school ceremony. It felt more like the instant before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seemed to pause. Marcus Carter remained beside the side entrance with both hands folded in front of him. He noticed several custodial employees peeking discreetly through the partially open service doors, having heard rumors that the principal almost canceled Elijah's appearance. They watched silently, proud, without saying a word. For years, they had cleaned classrooms after concerts ended, stacked chairs after applause faded, and quietly disappeared before the next morning's classes began. Today, one of their own stood beneath the brightest lights in the building. Mrs. Brooks looked toward Elijah and offered the smallest encouraging smile she could manage without drawing attention. He answered only with the slightest nod before returning his focus to the keyboard. Collins noticed that exchange and exhaled almost impatiently. In his mind, encouragement could never replace experience. Reputation could never depend on hope. Yet something else had begun shifting inside the room. Something beyond schedules, speeches, and expectations. The audience had stopped judging the young man because of where he came from, and started wondering who he truly was. Curiosity quietly replaced assumption. Doubt slowly gave way to anticipation. Without realizing it, nearly every person inside the magnificent old auditorium leaned forward by the same small distance, waiting for the first note that would either confirm every prejudice they carried into the room or quietly unravel them one careful measure at a time. Elijah let one slow breath fill his lungs before lowering his hands onto the keyboard. His fingertips rested lightly against the smooth ivory keys without pressing them, almost as though he were greeting an old friend after years apart. The grand piano felt different from the weathered upright at the church. The keys responded with effortless precision beneath the slightest touch, the polished ebony surface reflecting the warm afternoon light that poured through the stained glass above. For a brief moment, he could almost hear Mrs. Louise Bennett's gentle voice, reminding him that every instrument had its own personality, and the first responsibility of a musician was to listen before asking the piano to speak. He closed his eyes for one heartbeat, not to escape the audience, but to remember why he had accepted this unexpected responsibility. He was not sitting there to prove anyone wrong. He was sitting there because music had carried him through every difficult season of his life, and today it deserved to be heard. Behind him, Richard Collins shifted his weight almost imperceptibly before stepping toward the microphone once more. His polished smile remained carefully in place. "Before we continue," he said, his measured voice filling every corner of the auditorium, "I would simply remind our audience that today's substitute performer has had very little experience on a stage of this caliber. I am certain we all appreciate his willingness to help under difficult circumstances." Several polite chuckles drifted through the room again. They were quieter than before, almost uncertain now, but Elijah heard them all the same. He did not turn around. He simply rested both feet comfortably against the pedals and adjusted his posture with calm precision. Mrs. Brooks lowered her head for a second, disappointment softening her expression. She had hoped the principal would simply allow the young man to play without another unnecessary remark. Marcus Carter looked toward the stage from beside the service entrance, his weathered hands tightening gently around the brim of the maintenance cap he still carried. He knew exactly how words could linger long after conversations ended. He had experienced enough quiet dismissals throughout his own life to recognize one immediately. Yet he also knew something Richard Collins did not. Elijah had learned years ago that responding to disrespect with anger only gave it more power. Music had taught him another language entirely. Collins stepped away from the microphone again, folding his hands behind his back with complete confidence. In his mind, the ceremony would soon move forward exactly as scheduled after a brief and forgettable interruption. He imagined polite applause, a graceful transition, and another speech thanking the generous donors seated in the front rows. His attention had already begun drifting toward the remainder of the afternoon program. Near the center aisle, Board Chairman William Prescott continued watching Elijah with growing curiosity. He noticed details that others overlooked: the steady rhythm of the young man's breathing, the relaxed position of his shoulders, the absence of panic in his eyes. Prescott had attended enough professional concerts to recognize performers who trusted preparation more than confidence. He quietly removed his reading glasses and leaned forward another inch without realizing he had done so. A television cameraman slowly zoomed in until Elijah's hands nearly filled the monitor mounted beside his equipment. Thousands of people would eventually watch the anniversary celebration online, yet at that instant the auditorium felt strangely intimate, as though every person had become part of the same quiet conversation. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the flowering dogwood trees surrounding the historic campus. Sunlight danced across the stained glass, sending soft bands of crimson, sapphire, and amber gliding over the piano lid before settling across Elijah's sleeves. The old building itself seemed to breathe. Somewhere high in the balcony, an elderly alumnus who had graduated more than 50 years earlier folded his program and whispered to his wife, "Let the boy play." She nodded without taking her eyes off the stage. The orchestra members backstage remained perfectly still. A violinist unconsciously loosened her grip on the bow. A trumpet player lowered his instrument onto his lap. Even the student volunteers waiting to wheel the podium into place after the performance forgot about their next assignment. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever was about to happen. Elijah opened his eyes. Instead of looking toward the audience, he glanced briefly toward the side entrance where Marcus still stood in his work uniform. Their eyes met for only a second. Marcus offered the same quiet nod he had given his son before every recital, every rehearsal, every late-night practice inside the little church sanctuary. No smile, no grand gesture, just unwavering belief. Elijah answered with the faintest smile before returning his attention to the keyboard. He gently pressed the sustain pedal beneath his polished shoe, letting the mechanism settle into place with a sound so soft that only he could hear it. Then his right hand descended first, followed by his left, and the opening chord rose into the great hall with remarkable warmth, filling every wooden beam, every stained glass window, every marble column, and every silent heart with a richness that no one in the audience had expected from the quiet young man they had spent the last several minutes underestimating. The sound did not simply reach the audience. It settled over them like the first gentle rain after a long summer drought. The opening chord lingered beneath the vaulted ceiling with remarkable clarity, before flowing naturally into a melody so warm and expressive that even those who knew nothing about classical music instinctively stopped breathing for a process moment. Elijah's hands moved with quiet confidence, never rushing, never forcing the instrument to speak louder than necessary. Every note carried intention, every phrase unfolded with the patience of someone telling a story too important to interrupt. The Steinway responded as though it had been waiting for those hands all afternoon. Its rich bass filled the lower reaches of the hall while bright upper harmonies shimmered beneath the stained glass windows, blending with the golden afternoon light until music and sunlight seemed to move together. Several audience members unconsciously lowered their phones. Recording suddenly felt less important than listening. Richard Collins remained standing near the microphone, but the certainty that had defined his posture only moments earlier began to soften. He had expected hesitation, uneven rhythm, perhaps a missed passage caused by nerves. Instead, he heard balance, discipline, and emotional maturity that could not be explained away as luck. He quietly folded his arms across his chest, telling himself that one beautiful introduction did not guarantee an entire performance. Yet he did not step back toward the microphone again. He simply listened. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks felt her eyes becoming unexpectedly warm. She recognized every subtle decision Elijah made, the delicate pause before the second movement, the restrained dynamics she had encouraged him to trust instead of overwhelming the audience with volume. He was not merely reproducing notes from memory. He was sharing something deeply personal without saying a single word. She remembered Mrs. Louise Bennett once telling her that exceptional musicians never tried to impress people. They invited people into their hearts instead. Watching Elijah now, she finally understood exactly what the elderly teacher had meant. Marcus Carter stood perfectly still beside the service entrance. The sounds flowing across the auditorium carried him somewhere entirely different. He remembered late evenings outside the little brick church after finishing overtime shifts, sitting on the hood of his aging pickup truck while soft piano melodies drifted through the open sanctuary windows. Some nights the neighborhood had already fallen asleep before Elijah finally emerged carrying his backpack and sheet music beneath the stars. Marcus had often wondered whether anyone beyond those quiet church walls would ever hear what he heard every evening. Now they were hearing it. The members of the Board of Trustees exchanged silent glances that needed no explanation. William Prescott slowly removed the anniversary program resting on his lap and placed it beside his chair without taking his eyes off the stage. Beside him, another trustee quietly whispered, "Where has this young man been hiding?" Prescott answered without looking away from Elijah. "He was never hiding. We simply never looked." The sentence lingered between them with greater weight than either man expected. Across the auditorium, parents who had smiled politely moments earlier now leaned closer together with expressions of genuine amazement. One little girl sitting between her grandparents slowly reached for her grandfather's hand. An elderly alumnus closed his eyes, allowing the melody to carry him back through decades of memories connected to the old school building. Even the reporters stopped checking their equipment. Their cameras continued recording, but the people behind them had forgotten they were working. Elijah remained completely unaware of every reaction surrounding him. His attention stayed fixed on the conversation unfolding beneath his fingertips. The polished keys no longer felt unfamiliar. They felt alive. His breathing remained slow, and even as one musical phrase gently flowed into the next, with remarkable grace. Every lesson from Mrs. Bennett, every evening inside the church, every encouraging nod from Pastor Harper, every quiet ride home beside his father after another late rehearsal had become part of this performance. None of those people were physically seated beside him, yet he felt each of them with every measure. Then something happened that nobody had anticipated. As the familiar concert arrangement reached its central theme, Elijah introduced a subtle variation of his own. It was delicate enough that casual listeners simply experienced the melody becoming warmer, but musicians inside the hall immediately recognized what he had done. He had woven the Academy's 100-year-old school hymn into the composition so naturally that it seemed as though both pieces had always belonged together. Gasps spread quietly across the audience. Alumni looked toward one another in disbelief before slowly smiling. Several older graduates instinctively recognized the forgotten melody they had sung decades earlier during assemblies inside the same building. It was not a showy display of technical skill. It was an act of respect. Elijah had transformed the performance into a tribute to the school's history while honoring the music itself. William Prescott slowly sat back in his chair, his expression filled with quiet wonder. Mrs. Brooks covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Even Richard Collins blinked in surprise as recognition finally reached him. This was not the performance of an unprepared student filling empty time. This was the work of a thoughtful young artist who had spent countless hours studying not only music, but the very spirit of the institution that had so often failed to recognize him. And as the final echoes of the transformed melody floated gently beneath the stained glass ceiling, the silence that followed no longer belonged to doubt. It belonged entirely to awe. The final chord dissolved slowly into the vast wooden ceiling, leaving behind a silence unlike anything the old auditorium had experienced in years. No one reached for a phone. No program rustled across a lap. Even the air seemed to stand perfectly still, as though the building itself wanted to hold on to the last vibration before allowing it to disappear forever. Elijah kept both hands resting gently above the keyboard. He did not look toward the audience searching for approval. He did not turn toward the principal, waiting for a reaction. Instead, he lowered his eyes to the polished piano, watching the soft reflections of stained glass ripple across its black surface, while the sustain pedal quietly released beneath his shoe. The notes were gone, but something invisible still lingered between every person in the room. Warm afternoon light continued drifting across the stage, wrapping the instrument in gentle shades of amber and sapphire. Dust floated lazily through the sunbeams, each tiny particle glowing for only a moment before disappearing again. Elijah inhaled slowly, catching the faint scent of polished wood, mixed with fresh lilies, decorating the front of the stage. It reminded him of Sunday mornings at the little church, where music had never been measured by applause, but by the comfort it brought to tired hearts. He remembered Mrs. Louise Bennet smiling from the old piano bench, correcting his posture with remarkable patience, while reminding him that silence was never empty. Silence was where people discovered whether the music had truly reached them. For the first time since walking onto the stage, Elijah allowed himself to breathe without carrying the weight of expectation. He had done exactly what he promised himself he would do. He had honored every lesson, every sacrifice, and every person who believed in him long before anyone else noticed his gift. Whatever happened next no longer belonged to him. It belonged to those who had been listening. Near the side entrance, Marcus Carter quietly removed his maintenance cap and held it against his chest. His eyes never left his son. Pride settled across his weathered face without the need for a single word. He remembered carrying a small folding keyboard home from a neighborhood yard sale when Elijah was only 8 years old. Half the keys barely worked, and one speaker buzzed constantly, but his son's smile that afternoon had filled their tiny apartment with something far greater than music. Marcus had often wondered whether giving up overtime pay to drive Elijah to church rehearsals had been the responsible decision. Standing there beneath the shadows of the service doorway, he realized he had never sacrificed anything at all. Every mile, every late evening, every repaired pair of shoes had quietly become part of this moment. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks gently wiped a tear from the corner of her eye before anyone could notice. During her 32 years of teaching, she had watched countless gifted students perform difficult pieces with flawless technique, yet very few had ever managed to create the kind of silence now resting over the audience. She understood that technical excellence impressed people. Honest music transformed them. Somewhere near the center of the auditorium, an elderly graduate who had returned for the centennial celebration slowly placed one trembling hand over his heart. Beside him, his wife smiled softly through tear-filled eyes without saying anything. Words suddenly seemed far too small for what they had experienced together. Richard Collins remained motionless only a few feet behind the piano. The confidence that had surrounded him all afternoon had quietly dissolved into something much heavier. He replayed his own remarks from earlier in the ceremony, hearing them now through completely different ears. The carefully chosen words that once sounded reasonable suddenly felt painfully narrow. He had looked at Elijah and seen only a maintenance worker's son standing beside an expensive instrument. He had never asked what hours of unseen dedication might have carried that young man to this stage. He had never imagined that extraordinary character could grow quietly in places prestige rarely bothered to notice. The magnificent old auditorium reflected more than sound that afternoon. It reflected truth. Every polished wooden beam, every stained glass window, every century-old brick seemed to whisper the same lesson with remarkable gentleness. Talent could be overlooked. Opportunity could be delayed. Respect could be withheld. But genuine excellence possessed a quiet patience that eventually made itself impossible to ignore. Elijah finally lifted his hands away from the keyboard and folded them calmly in his lap. He did not smile triumphantly. He did not celebrate. He simply sat there beneath the warm light, grateful for the chance to let music speak where arguments never could. In that peaceful stillness, before a single person remembered how to applaud, the distance that had separated one quiet young man from an entire room full of assumptions had already disappeared, replaced by something infinitely stronger than recognition. It was understanding. The silence finally broke when one pair of hands began to clap. The sound was measured, steady, and unmistakably sincere. Every head turned toward the front row where William Prescott had risen slowly to his feet. The chairman of the board of trustees continued applauding without looking around to see whether anyone would join him. His eyes remained fixed on Elijah with the quiet respect usually reserved for lifelong colleagues rather than students. A second later, another trustee stood beside him. Then, an elderly graduate near the center aisle pushed himself upright with the help of his cane and added his applause. Within moments, the sound spread through the auditorium like a gentle wave rolling across calm water. Parents stood, alumni stood, teachers stood. Even members of the orchestra waiting backstage placed their instruments aside and walked into view, applauding with smiles that no longer carried surprise but admiration. The magnificent hall that had fallen silent because of music now filled with applause that seemed determined never to end. Elijah slowly rose from the piano bench. His expression remained humble, almost surprised by the overwhelming response surrounding him. He placed one hand lightly against the polished edge of the Steinway before offering a small, respectful bow. The applause only grew louder. Bright afternoon sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, illuminating thousands of tiny dust particles drifting through the air like golden sparks, suspended above the audience. Richard Collins remained standing exactly where he had been since the final note faded. Around him, people continued rising from their seats, yet he felt strangely alone inside the enormous auditorium. The words he had spoken before the performance replayed themselves with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered questioning Elijah's readiness. He remembered the restrained laughter that followed his remarks. He remembered believing he was protecting the school's reputation. Yet standing before him was the very student who had just elevated that reputation, far beyond anything carefully planned speeches could have accomplished. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks quietly stepped toward the front of the stage. She did not interrupt the applause. Instead, she looked toward Collins with calm eyes that held neither accusation nor triumph. There was only quiet understanding. The principal lowered his gaze for the first time that afternoon. William Prescott slowly approached the stage while the applause gradually softened into respectful silence. Taking the microphone, he smiled warmly before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have attended this ceremony for more than 20 years. I have listened to internationally recognized musicians, celebrated distinguished alumni, and welcomed leaders from across our nation. Yet today I witnessed something that reminded me why schools exist in the first place." His voice echoed gently through the hall. "Education is not about recognizing potential after everyone else already sees it. It is about having the wisdom to recognize it before the world applauds." His words settled over the audience with remarkable weight. Several trustees nodded quietly. Prescott turned toward Elijah. "Young man, who arranged that variation of our school hymn?" Elijah hesitated for a moment before answering with respectful calm. "I did, sir. I wanted everyone who graduated from Westbridge to hear a piece of their own story inside the music." A quiet murmur spread across the room. Prescott smiled even more warmly. "Then you have given this school a gift that none of us expected." He extended his hand. Elijah accepted it with quiet humility, and another wave of applause swept through the auditorium. Richard Collins watched the exchange without moving. For years, he had believed leadership required certainty above all else. Admitting mistakes, in his mind, weakened authority. Yet, as he looked across the faces filling the hall, he realized the people before him no longer cared about appearances. They cared about truth. Slowly, almost cautiously, he stepped toward the microphone once more. The applause faded naturally as everyone turned to face him. Collins looked briefly toward Elijah before allowing his eyes to travel across the audience. His shoulders seemed noticeably lighter than they had been only minutes earlier, as though certainty itself had become too heavy to carry. He drew one slow breath before speaking. There are moments in every leader's life when accomplishments matter less than honesty. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the polished confidence that had defined it throughout the ceremony. "Today I made assumptions about a young man based on circumstances instead of character. I saw his background before I saw his dedication. I judged his opportunity instead of recognizing his preparation. For that, I am deeply sorry." The words hung in the air without excuse or qualification. Elijah looked at him calmly, offering neither resentment nor satisfaction. Collins turned fully toward him. "You honored this school far more than I honored you today. Thank you for reminding all of us that excellence does not ask permission before revealing itself." Warm afternoon light settled across both men as the audience rose once again, not simply celebrating extraordinary music, but witnessing something far rarer. Pride had quietly stepped aside so humility could finally be heard. For several long seconds after Richard Collins lowered the microphone, no one moved. The apology did not feel rehearsed. It did not sound like something crafted to protect an image or satisfy the audience. It carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had finally seen beyond the assumptions he had quietly carried for years. The applause that followed was different from before. It was no longer directed only toward Elijah's extraordinary performance. It honored the rare courage required to admit a mistake in front of an entire community. Elijah stood quietly beside the grand piano, his hands resting naturally at his sides. He looked toward the principal with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the afternoon. There was no bitterness in his eyes, no desire to make anyone feel smaller than they already did. Mrs. Louise Bennett had once told him that forgiveness was not something people offered because others deserved it. They offered it because resentment made the heart too heavy to carry beautiful music. He had never forgotten those words. Richard Collins stepped away from the microphone and slowly approached Elijah, until only a few feet separated them. The enormous auditorium had become so quiet again that even the soft creak of polished floorboards beneath their shoes seemed unusually clear. Collins extended his hand without saying anything else. Elijah looked at it for only a brief moment before reaching forward and accepting it with a firm but gentle handshake. Cameras quietly captured the moment, but neither man appeared aware of them. What mattered could not be photographed. It could only be witnessed. William Prescott smiled as he watched the exchange. Then he turned toward the audience once more. Today has reminded all of us that character is revealed not only by remarkable talent, but by remarkable grace. His voice carried easily through the hall. Young man, the Board of Trustees would be honored if you would join us at next month's annual scholarship dinner as our featured performer. A quiet gasp moved through the audience before another wave of applause filled the room. Elijah blinked in surprise. Before he could answer, Prescott continued. And there is something else. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a cream-colored envelope bearing the Academy seal. Earlier this morning, we intended to announce only one Centennial Arts Scholarship recipient. I believe that decision deserves another look. Several trustees nodded immediately. One by one, they voiced their agreement without hesitation. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks covered her mouth again, tears brightening her eyes. She had spent years hoping someone with the authority to change Elijah's future would finally recognize what had always been standing quietly in front of them. Richard Collins looked toward the trustees before turning back to Elijah. His voice remained steady, though noticeably softer than it had been throughout the ceremony. If you choose to continue your musical education after graduation, this academy will support that dream in every way we can. Elijah looked down briefly at the polished stage before lifting his eyes again. Thank you, sir, he said quietly. That means more than I can explain. Collins gave a small nod. No, he replied with gentle honesty. Thank you for teaching me something I should have understood long ago. Near the service entrance, Marcus Carter remained standing with his maintenance cap still held against his chest. Several faculty members who had worked beside him for years quietly walked over to congratulate him. One history teacher shook his hand. Another thanked him for raising such an extraordinary young man. Marcus accepted every kind word with humble gratitude, yet his eyes never left Elijah. He knew his son's greatest achievement that afternoon had not been flawless music. It had been responding to unfairness without allowing it to change who he was. Elijah slowly walked across the stage until he stood beside his father. Without saying a word, Marcus placed one hand gently on his son's shoulder. That simple gesture carried the memory of every early morning, every repaired pair of shoes, every late drive home from church rehearsals, and every quiet sacrifice that had never asked for recognition. Elijah smiled. We did it, he whispered. Marcus gently shook his head. No, son, he answered with quiet warmth. You simply became the man you have been growing into all along. Sunlight continued pouring through the stained glass windows as the audience remained standing. The old auditorium, built 100 years earlier to celebrate learning, somehow felt younger than it had at the beginning of the afternoon. Conversations no longer centered on prestigious donors, flawless schedules, or carefully planned ceremonies. Instead, people spoke softly about kindness, perseverance, and the remarkable way one quiet student had reminded an entire community that dignity could never be measured by a person's position, income, or appearance. As Elijah looked once more toward the grand piano waiting peacefully beneath the golden light, he realized that the most meaningful performance of the day had not ended with the final chord. It had continued inside every heart willing to listen. The ceremony slowly drew to a close, yet almost no one seemed eager to leave. Conversations that had once centered on rankings, achievements, and prestigious universities had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful. Parents stood together in small circles speaking softly about the young man whose music had reminded them that greatness often grows where very few people choose to look. Students who had hurried through the hallways every day without noticing the maintenance staff now glanced toward Marcus Carter with entirely different eyes. Respect had entered the room so quietly that no one could remember the exact moment it arrived, only that everything somehow felt different. Elijah remained near the stage as volunteers carefully prepared the auditorium for the reception that would follow the anniversary celebration. The grand piano rested beneath the stained glass windows exactly where it had stood all afternoon, its polished surface now reflecting the softer colors of the approaching evening. The building had grown noticeably quieter. Folding chairs were gently straightened. Floral arrangements were carefully carried toward the exits. Somewhere in the distance, a vacuum cleaner hummed faintly as another custodian began restoring the auditorium to its usual order. Marcus smiled when he heard the familiar sound. Work, after all, always continued. Without saying anything, Elijah quietly loosened the sleeves of his suit jacket and walked toward a nearby storage closet. A few moments later, he returned, carrying a broom and a dustpan. Several students watched with puzzled expressions as he knelt beside the front row, gathering scattered programs and bits of ribbon that had fallen during the celebration. Marcus looked at him with gentle surprise. "Son," he said softly, "you do not have to do that today." Elijah smiled while continuing to sweep the small pile into the dustpan. "I know," he answered, "but someone always has to leave the room ready for tomorrow." Marcus looked at his son for a long moment, before quietly picking up another broom, leaning against the wall. Without another word, father and son worked side by side, exactly as they had done so many evenings before. The only difference was that this time they were no longer invisible. One by one, people preparing to leave noticed them. A group of graduating seniors silently stepped forward and began collecting empty water bottles from beneath the seats. A teacher folded abandoned programs into neat stacks. Two members of the orchestra helped move heavy music stands back into storage. No one had been asked. No announcement had been made. Kindness simply spread from one person to another without needing instructions. Richard Collins stood near the center aisle watching the quiet scene unfold. He removed his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and walked toward the stage. For a brief second, Marcus looked uncertain, but Collins simply accepted another broom from the storage closet and began sweeping beside them. There were no photographers waiting now. Most reporters had already left. No applause followed the gesture. It was not performed for recognition. It was simply the right thing to do. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks watched from the back of the auditorium, smiling through gentle tears as warm evening sunlight stretched across the wooden floor. The brilliant colors shining through the stained glass windows had softened into delicate shades of gold and rose. Dust floated peacefully through the fading light, while the old building settled into the comforting stillness that always followed a memorable day. William Prescott paused before leaving and looked back one final time. The chairman smiled quietly at the simple picture before him. A principal, a maintenance worker, a gifted student, teachers, and volunteers, all cleaning the same room together without titles separating them. He realized that no speech delivered during the centennial celebration would be remembered as clearly as that silent image. Years later, people would undoubtedly remember the extraordinary piano performance. They would remember the apology. They would remember the scholarship. Yet perhaps the lesson that endured longest would come from what happened after the applause disappeared. Elijah finished sweeping the final row and carefully returned the broom to the storage closet. Before leaving, he walked back to the grand piano one last time. He gently rested his fingertips against its polished edge without playing another note. The instrument no longer needed to speak. Everything that mattered had already been said. He looked toward his father, who nodded with the same quiet pride he had carried since those first evenings outside the little church. Together they walked toward the wide wooden doors leading outside. As they stepped into the cool evening air, a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the historic campus. Behind them, the stained glass windows glowed softly against the darkening sky. And inside the empty auditorium, the last rays of sunlight rested upon the silent piano, before slowly fading into dusk. No applause remained. No speeches echoed through the hall. Only a peaceful stillness lingered, quietly reminding anyone willing to remember that kindness is never weakness. True greatness never needs to announce itself, and the most powerful sound in the world is often the silence that follows when every prejudice has finally been replaced by understanding.